Good Friday morning to all the backyard naturalists watching season 2, episode 21, Fly Society. My name is Tim, part of the research team at the Urban Ecology Center, and your host for today's episode on the housefly, probably one of the most underappreciated and underloved creature that graces our backyards with their presence. I don't expect to get you to love the housefly by the end of the program, but I do hope that after learning a bit more about this creature, that we'll all have a slightly greater appreciation of kin. And as a reminder, kin is a pronoun that Robin Wall Kimmerer suggested we start using for all animals, plants, living things to replace the word it. I'm looking out at a delightful sky full of stratus clouds that have replaced the cumulus clouds and the cumulonimbus clouds that brought us some rain last night. I'll also quickly say that the Backyard Naturalist is part of the UEC in my backyard, which can be found on the Urban Ecology Center website. And this goes along with my regular plug for the Urban Ecology podcast and a plug for one of my primary sources of fly information for this episode from How Stuff Works, including the podcast Stuff You Should Know. Happy summer. No matter how you mark the beginning of summer, astronomical summer began Sunday, meteorological summer began June 1st, and the Labor Day start to summer began May 31st. So no matter what your lens is, we are all now solidly in the summer season. One thing to think about is that with few exceptions, any bird that you encountered in June, seeing it, hearing it, is very likely breeding in the area. So it's a great way to kind of compile a likely breeding birds list for your backyard. Just keep track of the birds that you see and hear in June, because they're very likely nesting. And looking at the next few weeks, we have a couple great lectures coming up, bookending the 4th of July weekend. Next week, my good friend and colleague, Meenal, is going to give a fascinating, eye-opening, and inspiring talk on plastics in our environment. I know this statement to be true because I've heard her talk a couple times now, and I've learned so much from her each time, and I'm sure you will too. And we're also super excited to be hosting Susan Carpenter, the native plant gardener at the University of Wisconsin-Madison Arboretum, and one of the top bee experts in the state, who will be talking about bumblebees. So please continue to tune in every Friday morning. And if you enjoy these sessions, I encourage you to purchase a subscription to the Friday morning talks. And of course, my heartfelt thanks to all of the current subscribers who have been keeping the series accessible and sustainable and alive. Okay, flies. The first thing that came to my mind for whatever reason is that we don't have animals called walks, runs, climbs, or swims. At least I don't think we do, but we do have animals called flies. Flies are eukaryotic arthropod insect animals, generally in the order Diptera, which translates as two wings in Greek. Di means two, ptera means wing. So for example, pterodactyl means finger wing, and helicopter means spiral wing. And you'll see that this order includes some of the more annoying members of our backyard community: mosquitoes, horseflies, deer flies, fruit flies, no-see-ums, midges, botflies. And to learn more about insects in general and the many different orders, you can go back to the UEC in my backyard for past episodes on spittlebugs, snow fleas, fireflies, ladybird beetles, and more. Calling this order Diptera, or two wings, is somewhat of a misnomer, arguably, I guess, because while most insects, at least outwardly, are identified as having two pairs of wings or four wings, quadrupteras, Diptera, while it's true that outwardly we only see one pair of wings or two wings, diptera, they arguably still have two pairs of wings. It's just that the second pair of wings is much reduced into a structure called a haltere. So for example, here's a crane fly, an insect that's frequently misidentified as a large mosquito. If you take a cursory look at it, it looks like it has only one pair of wings, which is true. But if you look closely between the wings and the back legs, you see that those drumstick-like appendages, those are the halteres, and they've evolved from the hind wings in flies. And essentially, the halteres function as mini gyroscopes that kind of help orient the body position in flight. So even though Diptera technically only have one pair of flying wings, they need those reduced hind wings or halteres in order to fly. They can't fly without them. And in fact, even though the actual flapping and flying part of the halteres no longer functions, they do allow flies to do some pretty advanced and technical flight. There are about 125,000 described species of fly that share the characteristics of having a very mobile head, large compound eyes, piercing and or sucking mouth parts, short lifespans, and foot pads that allow them to cling to smooth surfaces. Larval flies often develop inside a food source. The eggs are laid inside the food source, so like maggots, bot flies. They're among the earliest and most important pollinators. And in addition to being spreaders of some of the worst human diseases, they are, as I mentioned, objectively among the world's most annoying insects. Within the order Diptera, houseflies are in the family Muscidae, which is a group of about 4,000 described species, which includes houseflies and stable flies, which are synanthropic in nature. And again, synanthropic species specialize in habitats created by humans, such as, in this case, houses and stables and backyards and garbage dumps and other human habitats. Most Muscidae, however, are not synanthropic, and they feed on a wide variety of things from blood to detritus to other animals. They're often attracted to things like sugar and sweat and tears and blood and sometimes rotting flesh, which is why some of these species in this family are some of the most important in forensic work, where people are trying to identify the time of death of a body. It can be narrowed down by the stages of the maggots that are found in the carcass. Having said that, I probably should give a little bit of a warning that some of the things mentioned during this talk could be described by some as a little gross. So if you don't have much tolerance for these things, you may want to be either close to your mute button, or you can do what Jesse does during horror movies and kind of watch between your closed fingers in your hand. So the common housefly further belongs to the genus Musca, and there are about 85 described species, including the face fly, which if you see horses or cattle in pasture being harassed by flies using their tails and their twitchy skin to try to get them off, a lot of times those are face flies. And then you have the Australian bush fly here and the bazaar fly. And then we finally arrive at Musca domestica, also known as the housefly. And I pretty much guarantee that we all have hosted this critter in our backyard, certainly, and very likely in our houses. It's not the only fly that makes their way into our houses, but it's by far the most common. We usually don't see this much detail, partly because this is magnified and partly because we're usually too busy shooing or swatting the fly. But if you do happen to get a closer look at your fly, the housefly is identified by a darkish body with 4 stripes along the thorax, or the middle part of the body, head, thorax, abdomen, and then red eyes, which are set slightly farther apart in females. Flies have been portrayed in stories and art forms for thousands of years. We often accentuate their dirtiness or their annoyance. There's a song, "Shoo Fly, Don't Bother Me." Ancient civilizations around the world have made sacrifices to fly gods to keep swarms out of houses or temples. They're in ancient Greek myths. They're in Aesop stories, portrayed as the impertinent insect. They're symbolized in ancient Egyptian amulets, and they're often portrayed in stories and poetry for their fleeting nature or their portrayal of death, like in Emily Dickinson's "I Heard a Fly Buzz When I Died," or the William Blake poem, "The Fly." "Little fly, thy summer's play, my thoughtless hand has brushed away. Am not I a fly like thee, or art not thou a man like me? For I dance and drink and sing, till some blind hand shall brush my wing. If thought is life and strength and breath, and the want of thought is death, then am I a happy fly if I live or if I die." There have been 5 movies in the Fly movie franchise between sequels and reboots. with various fly-human mashups and statements on the ethics of advancing scientific research. Like its avian counterpart, the house sparrow, the housefly Musca domestica very likely has the widest distribution of any insect in the world because of its association and co-migration with humans over thousands of years. And they followed us to all parts of the world, even to some Arctic areas. So houseflies are everywhere, and they've been around for a long time. The tagline in Jurassic Park is an adventure 65 million years in the making. And the housefly in its basic shape or form broke off right around 65 million years ago. So I guess that's one thing to think about when you're annoyed by a fly, that fly, like the birds, has a link to the dinosaurs because they inhabited the earth at the same time. So at face value, the fly has just your basic insect anatomy, exoskeleton, body parts, wings, etc. They have two common eyes that are divided up into 3,000 to 6,000 simple eyes. And here you see the male housefly on the left where the eyes are almost touching, and then the female on the right where there's greater separation between the eyes. And, you know, two faces here that a mother's gotta love. This system results in the fly seeing the world in sort of like a mosaic or a grid. They don't focus on one thing in particular like we tend to do, but they get this really good overall sense of their surroundings. And the system also allows them to process visual information 7 times more quickly than humans. And it's kind of cool to think that in some respects, to a fly, we humans are really moving in slow motion. They have a much higher flicker fusion rate, it's called. So the human brain can process 60 images per second, and a fly can process about 250 images per second. So they can detect movement that to our eyes would look as if nothing happened at all, that if there was just steady state, they can detect movements that we can't. And that's why it can be so darn hard to swat a fly, and why we had to develop a tool that helped even the playing field. And also why the best human fly swatters I know don't go for where the fly is. They try to anticipate where the fly is going to be. So, you know, clapping your hands above the fly, in front of it. Not that I'm advocating for killing living things. Above the common eyes are the ocelli, those 3 little circles that form a triangle, and they function as a compass. And they're always orienting these towards the sun to help maintain its bearings. And this is one of the main reasons why flies often end up in our windowsills, because it's really hard for them to operate, disconcerting without having the sun around for orientation. And so it's hard for them to get themselves to leave the comfort of being able to see the sun from your window to find another way out of your house, which is why the windowsill ends up being a graveyard for many flies. Flies also have 2 small antennae where you would expect the nose on a face to be. And like our nose, these primarily function as or for a sense of smell. So they detect compounds in the air, just as our scent receptors in our nose do. Also attached to the head is a retractable proboscis that provides taste receptors in the form of maxillary palps. And it's also the tool by which a fly eats. So again, performing a similar function to our mouth, which both tastes and eats. So really, flies are just like us. They have eyes to see with, a nose to smell with, and a mouth to taste and eat with. Their mouth, unlike ours, has a spongy labellum at the end, the tip of the proboscis, that it uses to eat with. So 2 things right off the bat. First of all, houseflies cannot bite us. Unlike their cousins, the deer flies, they just don't have the capability to bite us. And houseflies cannot eat solid food. They can, however, eat liquid foods like blood, sucking the medium up using their proboscis through capillary action and allowing that liquid food to go straight to their stomachs. But what is a fly to do with a yummy piece of solid food, like, you know, a piece of dog poo? This is where people get most grossed out, and probably rightfully so, but it still is fascinating, a fascinating adaptation. So first it uses the proboscis kind of like a hammer or a spatula to kind of break up the solid food into a small enough bit. And then once the food is small enough, it'll regurgitate saliva and digestive juices onto the food until it's dissolved in a liquid form, which then it can, again, use the proboscis to suck up the liquid nutrition. And you can also see a pretty good shot of the fly ocelli, that little pyramid shaped ocelli between the eyes here. So while this sounds disgusting to us, Josh and Chuck from the Stuff You Should Know podcast rightly point out that this is essentially the same process that humans use. We just do it inside our bodies. So first we chew to break up the food into smaller parts. Then we introduce saliva and digestive enzymes to extract the nutrients. And it's the same thing as the fly. We just do it neatly contained within our bodies instead of doing it outside our bodies like a fly where the whole world can see it. But unlike humans and more like cows, if a tasty morsel just won't dissolve the way it's supposed to, and it really wants that piece of food, the fly can put it in a crop, and then it'll later move the food back and forth between the crop and the proboscis, just like a cow chewing its cud until the food finally dissolves. So the process of regurgitating onto food before ingesting it is where we introduce a bit of a problem for humans, because flies have been known to be vectors of quite a few problematic diseases like typhoid fever, salmonella, leprosy, cholera, intestinal worms, and bacteria that lead to dysentery. So if you are a bit squeamish, you might want to turn down the volume for the next minute or so. But if a fly that was just hanging out with dried blood or feces decides to land on your sandwich or a piece of fruit, not only could it have nasty things on its legs, they also poop just about every time they land. And, you know, the things could fall off their legs, just like when we track dog poop from our shoes onto the carpet. It also will likely regurgitate on your food. And so anything that it has in or on it that are pathogenic, and the gut contents, they're likely going to end up on your food, and then some of that will end up in you. So before you get too alarmed, our bodies do have an immune system that can almost always fight whatever small pathogen a fly may introduce to you. And not all flies are carrying diseases. So there's really no need to panic if a fly lands on your food. And, you know, I hate to say it, but we've all tasted fly vomit many times in our life. But it's probably a good idea still to try to minimize the time a fly spends on your food. And interestingly, evidence supports that urban flies are actually a bit cleaner and safer than rural flies, because rural flies can expose your food to fertilizers and pesticides, which your immune system doesn't fight. But the truth, while it's complicated, is that you really don't need to worry about getting sick from flies, and the likelihood is pretty low. And if you think about it, you've lived your life until now with flies. So, okay, it's safe to listen again, I think, if you were closing your eyes during that last part. And we'll move on to a cleaner part of the fly, the wings. As I mentioned at the beginning, the flies have the two large wings for flight, and then the two tiny halteres that are under the flying wings. And you can see them in this picture as those two orange wafers at the end of the stalks. And again, these are used they function like gyroscopes. They allow a fly to move very quickly, to hover, to maintain balance. If you were to remove one of those halteres, you get a fly that would be disoriented and only able to fly in circles. If you removed both of the halteres, the fly would be so disoriented that it wouldn't be able to fly at all. The flapping wings operate at about 200 to 300 flaps per second, much, much faster than a hummingbird or a hummingbird moth, which are right about 80 beats per second. And even though flies can move very quickly, their top speed is only about 4.5 miles per hour. So most of us could easily outrun a flying fly. Even Kim, when she's doing her marathons, probably running faster than a fly. So fly legs are segmented and jointed with tiny hairs called tarsi that are actually used for taste. So a fly can taste with the tarsi in its mouth and its legs, which is a bonus. In fact, if you see a fly rubbing its legs together like it's cleaning them, that's actually what they're doing. They're removing the material that it just tasted so it can taste the next thing that it lands on, like a good palate cleansing in between food or wine. At the tips of the legs are these tiny pulvilli that act as moist suction pads or grippers, which is why a fly can hang out on your walls, your windows, and even your ceiling. And above the suction cups are claws that they use to disengage or unstick the suction cups, because that's just as important. When they walk up a wall, they walk up with a gait. So they have 6 legs, and 3 of those legs are always sticking to the wall, and the other 3 legs, the opposite legs, are moving. So at any time you have 3 legs on the wall, 3 legs moving. That doesn't happen on the ceiling, however. In the ceiling, they always have 4 legs stuck and 2 legs moving. So they're a little bit slower walking on a ceiling. And I just love that there are people studying this stuff. When a fly lands on the ceiling, it goes straight towards the ceiling. Then at the very last second, does a little roll, and it uses the front 2 legs to act as a shock absorber, and then the back 4 legs stick. Female houseflies have retractable ovipositors that they use in reproduction, and male flies have retractable edegi that they use for mating. And a female only has to mate once to get enough sperm to last her for her life. So after that first mating, she will reject any suitors. Their life is short. The average lifespan for a fly is about 3 weeks, and the maximum lifespan is about 3 months. However, they can exist longer than that because if conditions get really bad and there's no food, maybe there's a drought, maybe you close down your cabin for the winter, a fly can go into a state of suspended animation or diapause that can last a few months, which would buy the fly some time to wait for conditions to improve or for you to come back in the spring to open up the cabin again. Fly courtship is likely more delicate and nuanced than you or I likely anticipated. It involves pheromones, vibrating wings, head strokes, and when the female does lay her egg clutch, another chemical is released that attracts other females to lay their eggs in the same spot. So you get a cluster of egg broods from several females together. The life cycle of a housefly is pretty standard. Complete metamorphosis starting with an egg. A female lays up to 500 eggs in her lifetime in batches somewhere between 75 and 150. So if you do the math, they can lay 3-4 clutches in their lifetime. The emerging fly larvae are pretty cool. You know them as maggots. And again, for flies, we use their presence in forensics. I guess I'll give a little bit of another heads up that this is pretty gross. I think it's fascinating, but for many, many years, maggots have been used to help clean open wounds in people. It's very effective. In fact, there's a whole podcast on that if you're excited about it. Again, it's pretty gross, but they do a really good job. They're eating machines, so they're really eating any kind of decaying flesh you have in a wound. They breathe through their butts, which allows them to just pretty much eat nonstop as larvae. So fly larvae are pretty much eating machines. And kind of uninterrupted. They're usually the eggs are laid in the food source, whether that's rotting meat or food waste or cow pies. And then once they've eaten and gone through a few stages, instars, they form a hard pupa that darkens as it matures. And this pupa has been a really promising food source and protein source, not only for like fish like tilapia or humans and others, and larval stages of flies too could be an excellent kind of these cleaner stages before they become the gross adults, have a lot of promise for protein, not only for us, but for other animals. The pupae darkens as it matures, and then an adult fly emerges from it. And the adult fly actually is, as it's emerging from that pupa, it has a bump on its head that it uses to help crack open that hard pupa. And you may see them, pupa for a lot of insects are some of the most confusing things to see them in the soil It's just this hard case that's not moving. It's essentially a cocoon. And so the adult needs that hard bump to kind of crack open the pupa and come out, just like a baby bird often will have a tooth on its bill to help it crack out of an egg. And then for both the bird and the fly, that bump or the tooth kind of is just absorbed back into its body. The whole process from egg to adult takes about a week. In ideal conditions, it can take up to 2 months if conditions are bad. And so ideal conditions would be warm and moist. And in another similarity to birds, or most birds, once an adult emerges from the pupa or once a bird leaves the nest, they're pretty much at their adult size. They don't grow any more than that. But unlike birds, the adult fly is ready to mate less than 24 hours after emerging from the pupa. I do have a couple of videos I'm going to wait till the end. And I don't know if I've really done my job to get you to appreciate flies more, and I'm not even sure that was my goal today. History has not been kind to houseflies, from community-wide eradication efforts with pesticides to a swat that fly contest for children in Montreal, to the Four Pests campaign by Mao Zedong in China that I mentioned in the very first Backyard Naturalist on house sparrows more than a year ago. There is a pretty horrific example of flies being used as a weapon in World War II. The Japanese developed bombs that had 2 compartments. One was filled with houseflies and the other a bacterial slurry of cholera-carrying bacteria that coated the houseflies. And then when they were let loose, they were deployed in 2 locations in mainland China, when it resulted in the death of over 400,000 victims, but it spared the troops that had been vaccinated in advance. On the other hand, and on a lighter note, houseflies are extremely important, as I mentioned, as sources of protein for all kinds of living organisms. They're decomposers. They support quite a lot of different forms of life, from bacteria to frogs, amphibians, and reptiles. We even have plants, Venus flytraps, and other fly-eating plants, sparrows. So they feed a lot in our environment. They have the potential to help humans with their sustainability issue around food. There's a lot of promise in using flies in waste recycling. And as I mentioned, the pupa are excellent food sources for farm tilapia. And experts even believe there's potential that they'll be used to fight cancer in the future. And they're pretty visually stunning, in my opinion. But I will let the final word for the day come from Ogden Nash, who wrote in 1942, "God in his wisdom made the fly and then forgot to tell us why." So thank you for hanging out with me today. I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and feel free to unmute and turn your cameras back on. I'm going to stop the recording.